assessment period. Sorry, distracted by the recording, but it's an assessment period for many right now, and a great time to reflect on what's worked well in executing remote online assessments, and what needs to be tweaked or even replaced in a future of hybrid face-to-face and distance learning. We're joined by Paul Cashian as chair today. Paul is institutional lead for assessment in the Office of Teaching and Learning at Coventry University, so exceptionally well placed to lead the discussion. Paul is also co-author of our recent publication, Achieving Teaching Excellence, which explores what authentic assessment looks like, how this can overcome cheating, and how with feedback and feed-forward, continuous improvement is achieved. I'm also delighted to introduce Professor Carol Evans, who sits on our editorial advisory board among her varying commitments, and has developed an integrated approach to assessment that she's going to talk a little bit about. Today is particularly poignant at the moment, so more on that to come. Professor Sally Brown is visiting professor at Edge Hill and emerita professor at Leeds Beckett, who has contributed widely on the theme of assessment and its connection to scholarship. It's wonderful to have you on board, Sally. And last but not least, the furthest panel member today, we're joined by Professor Bo Vandery, a longtime friend of McGraw and Professor of Operations Management at Nyren Road University in the Netherlands. I'm very excited for our discussion today on a continued focus area for McGraw Hill. So without further ado, I'll either hand back over to Bryony or Paul.
Hi, I'm just going to quickly run through the agenda for you before I hand over to Paul, who's going to chair today.
Laura. We missed a panelist.
Oh
no, did I?
Carol.
No, I mentioned Carol.
Did you mention Carol? Okay, sorry.
Carol, I think just maybe out of sequence to my slides, so apologies for any confusion.
Sorry, it is slightly out of sequence.
Thanks for looking out for me, Paul.
Okay, so after that slightly ropey start, we'll so yeah, thank you, Laura and Brian. Just to say, my name is Paul Cashian from Coventry University. I'll be chairing today. And I can see we've already got 125 participants, which I think is an indication of the importance and people attaching to assessment. I mean, many things have changed through the pandemic. Assessment being one of them. It's triggered and a lot of institutions, lots of discussion and debates about the nature of assessment. But I think what it's also done is brought to the fore many of the issues and areas around assessment that have actually been there for last couple of years, been developing and fermenting, and in many ways the pandemic has highlighted them and pushed them very much to the forefront of the agenda. So as you'll see when we get through to the three panelists, there's a wide range of issues that we're going to talk about. Not only authentic assessment, but the whole issue around the assessment, inclusivity, and digital poverty. All of these things were there in the background before the pandemic. I think they're very now much in the fore and being spoken about. And I'm very much the view that there's no going back. We need to take things forward from this point. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Sally to start proceedings. So over to you, Sally.
Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this, and thank you very much to you for giving me this opportunity to talk about the thing I probably care most about professionally of all the things in the world. Some of you know me already, some of you don't know me. I've been working in the field of assessment in higher education for 4 decades, and I think that over that time what we've seen is some substantial changes, but nothing as fast as what's happened in the last year, 18 months. So last March, I sat in my garden with my dear colleague, Kay Samble, who I used to work with at Northumberland, and she said, we've got a problem at the university we work with COVID, we've got to switch rapidly from on-campus assessment to off-site assessment. And so that started something that she and I have been working on ever since, which is lots and lots of very fast publications on our websites about what we can do about assessment post-COVID. And the key messages I'm trying to put across are that we need to use this opportunity to say, well, lots of universities have had to think differently about assessment in the last 18 months. Let's not go back to the bad old ways. Let's try and make assessment much more authentic, much more fit for purpose, and much more integrated with learning. It doesn't mean we have to throw away all the old methods, but if people want to use a traditional unseen time-constrained exam, by all means do, but tell us why you want to use it. It shouldn't be as a matter of default. And you should demonstrate that this is actually what is the best method compared to other methods and why. So as authentic assessment that engages students, isn't just about employability, it's about bringing about changes in the students themselves, making them better meta learners, more successful, more engaged, and actually it tends to be more fun. So authentic assessment methods don't have to be hugely time consuming. I put my website in the chat box. Look at the post on the 17th of August to look at a way that Kay and I've developed that makes it much more ready to use existing scenarios with new questions or new questions with existing scenarios or vice versa. And there are loads of examples how lots and lots of people, not just in the UK, but internationally, have taken those ideas on board and have actually put them into action. So students who engage in this kind of approach will give more, will do better, and will be more effective as learners. And the future focus of assessment, as far as Kay and I is concerned, is about rebalancing formative and summative assessment, using formative assessment as a vehicle for learning. They don't have to be tutor reliant. We can get students and colleagues engaged with it to make for a much better future. I think that must be my 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Sally. So I'm going to ask Bo next, and there's really some questions around your area in the chat box. I noticed, Bo, so off you go.
Thank you. And originally in our planning, Carol was going to go after Sally, and she requested to go after me. And now I know why, because who would like to follow up on Powerhouse Sally? So I'm going to try. My name is Bo. I'm in the Netherlands. I did my PhD actually in the United States. I haven't been in assessment for 40 years. I'm barely 40 years old, but I have been very much interested in the digital assessment for a long time already. And I think one of the things that Paul and Sally have both pointed out is that things have gotten kind of overheated over the last year and a half, and also in a good way. I have been preaching online assessments for years already at my university, and everyone was always a little bit like, yeah, but why? We have paper testing, it must be fine. Why would we change things? And now, of course, in the last year and a half, we've seen some major changes. Actually, I would say at my university, in the Netherlands, Nijrode, from March to May, I have seen more changes in how we do things, not just assessment, than in the 5 years before that combined. So I'm definitely a proponent of online testing, and indeed not just I've done a seminar through McGraw Hill last May on online assessments, and one of the things I mentioned there was don't just take your paper exam and just put it on a computer. That's not what you should do. You should rethink how you want to test. And of course, Sally and Paul know much more about that. One of the things we also ran into at our university is, of course, if you do the offsite testing, so students testing them, doing exams at home, is 2 issues that I would point out here briefly. One is that not all students have devices that can go online. Not all students have online access. In the Netherlands, not a huge problem. We did have a few international students on our campus that did not have computers, so we had to lend out some computers to them. But of course, I've also worked with some DFCs, digital faculty consultants from McGraw Hill, from abroad, from Africa, Asia, and there's definitely places where not all students have access to online testing facilities. So that's definitely something to consider in your online assessment strategy. And the second thing is proctoring. And I see there's just a comment on the chat as well, discussion on proctoring, lots of negative, positive points. We decided to use a system called Proctorio, which basically then, well, it looks at everything you do, and it automatically flags some behavior. So for example, if I would look down during an exam all the time, and it's a closed book exam, and I'm doing this all the time, you can see me in the video, then the system would flag that and say, well, this person is looking down a lot, probably at his notes. And then we had proctors actually looking at those videos. There was actually a lawsuit in the Netherlands started by students, not from our university, but from another university with a lot of co-signees from different universities against this because it's an invasion of privacy. But the judge decided that in these peculiar times, this was allowed because otherwise testing could not take place in a secure environment. But we have also made some major changes to how we do online testing. For example, we used to always have 3-hour exams for most of our programs. 3-hour online testing without toilet breaks? That's not really good, is it? So we've been making some changes along those lines. So now exams have to be shorter. You have to use different forms of exams, etc., etc. So I'm willing to take any questions on online assessment. And I see there's some in the chat, so I'll go and try and answer some of those while we hand it over to Carol.
Okay, I think, hello everybody. And first of all, I just want to say thank you for everybody, and you're all amazing for the work that you've been doing. I was in Australia last year, and we had to get 50,000 students online in 2.5 weeks. And a lot of you have done that. And the creativity that we have seen has been absolutely mind-blowing. I wanted to just pick out a couple of things in terms of lessons we learned from trying to move assessment online last year. And it aligns with what Sally's been saying and aligns with what Bo's been saying. I've put up a link to the EAT framework. It, for me, is it's an integrated framework that basically looks at what's best practice and also how can we do it efficiently, because there's a lot of busy work, as we know, and we certainly knew about it last year. To date now, I've now looked at 50,000 articles from 2000. That's a detailed review of 1,500, and we used it to reduce attainment gaps for BAME and SEC students. And we also are using it in Erasmus project at the moment across Europe. And the whole premise, which is very aligned, I think, with Sally, or Sally can correct me, is around empowering students. So it's all about agency, authenticity, and students being able to manage their environments and manage themselves. I'll pick up a couple of things in the 5 minutes I have, just on key things related to access and motivation, which were big issues for us all in COVID last year. So, for example, we all found that providing direct link to resources, which we've been asking about for a long time, really helps students. Recordings really helped. My big worry was for visually disabled students and verbally impaired. So blind and deaf students, how did online really work for them? And to what extent were we up to speed on being able to provide? Students with cognitive impairments, also, how are we designing things to make things work? Bo mentioned a bit about, I use Proctor a lot. I would argue we used thousands of hours testing, checking videos, which is not the best use of time. Whereas if we'd have gone along Sally's lines and changed the assessment, we could have got more valuable outputs. Some of our most successful gains was changing the assessment to get students to work with the community, to provide solutions in the community as part of their assessment. And that really impacted students' motivation. Again, big issues for us were around the content of what we actually put up on websites and keeping it simple and providing students with that route map so they can see their way through. Cutting down the content to think just purely about threshold concepts, rate limiting steps, what gets in the way of students progressing. And actually the question that we've been going on for a long time about reducing the volume of assessment. And a lot of my colleagues came to the conclusion last year, in actual fact, why is that assessment there? What was the point of it? Do we really need it? And actually simplifying it right down. One of the biggest issues with online exams was people were trying to manage the cheating aspect. And so they were doing things which put up questions for a very short space of time. My work is in cognitive processing. If you're a student who processes slowly, which is nothing to do with intelligence, you are proverbially dotted. You can't, because you can't scan. Also, not being able to go back to a previous screen, which was done in lots of exams to limit cheating, actually really goes against students who need to have that whole view. So in actual fact, what we started to do was really monitor who was doing well out of assessment and who was doing badly, especially in COVID times. And it was certain types of disability. And as the Disability Commission have recommended, we mustn't try and group all disabilities into one category, because it's mindless. It doesn't make any sense. The other biggest issue we had was engagement. And I don't know how many of you in the audience would go into a session with students to have no mics, no video, and be teaching and engaging with a black screen, which is mind-numbing. And so how do we engage students in delivering on courses? Takes mindsets to do that. How do they lead the sessions? How do we not get carried away with gadgets? Just because there are a lot of gizmos, what are the most appropriate tools for a particular course? Are students and academics trained? So what we did, we actually planned the academic calendar. We looked at the challenges for staff and students, and we ran weekly sessions for students and staff on how to access and use the tools well, so their time wasn't taken up with trying to grapple that. And AR and AV can be brilliant if used appropriately. Lastly, I'm just going to mention one more thing, and that was also building that community, building networks with students leading the networks, and formalizing mentoring. Every student, I believe, has something to offer. Every academic has something to offer. So if we create communities where everybody is expected to do that as part of their role in assessment, we actually manage to crack that engagement one. So I'm going to stop there. But as I said, my main area is how do we engage students in actually managing assessment for themselves. And one key thing that made one of the biggest differences very quickly for us was actually getting students to do the same moderation process as our academics from the beginning of their courses. So as you would with a moderation panel, we sent them out a series of scripts. We asked them to mark them and justify why they had got what they would give, and it made a massive difference. So actually, what we're saying is that online environment requires a different relationship that we've been asking for 30 years, but it can enable that to happen. But you do need to shift perceptions about students as partners. And if you do have massive numbers of students, using peer mentoring, being able to divide students up into groups and managing that is going to be absolutely fundamental. I'll stop there, so we can get the questions from everybody that's here.
Thanks, Carol, and thanks to Bo and to Sally as well. I mean, just looking at the areas coming up in the chat, there's a lot of questions there about proctoring, remote exams, how to deal with the issue of well, cheating, to put a blunt name on it. I'm just wondering, Bo, Sally, have you got any comments on that? I know, Sally, in the early, more than 12 months ago, you actually circulated something about alternative forms of assessments.
Yeah.
And you began to struggle with this. It became quite widely used, I think. Sally?
Yeah, thank you, Paul. That is true. That Kay and I sent out a series of things which we put on the website because we didn't think people could wait for a long form, something to come out. And the key thing has been that because they were very practical, and Kay's very scholarly, but they're very practical and usable. People have been using them literally all over the world. They've been translated into Japanese and Spanish and all sorts. A particular comment I wanted to answer in the chat box, I can't see who it's from, I'm afraid, sorry for that, but it's basically how flexible are institutions about the changes? Now, this is one we get asked all the time. I'm sure you do, Carol and Bo as well. But in terms of flexibility, this year has been special. Carol talked about this a bit. This year, we had to kind of go with what we could do. Every university's had to go with what you can do. And what I nowadays say in all my workshop is, please can we have somebody from the QA, quality assurance, actually in the session? Because there's loads of myths about what you're not allowed to do and what you can do. The questioner says we have to request changes almost a year in advance. I've got two answers to that. First of all, this year, there's been much more flexibility from university authorities. And secondly, I'm, as you know, a very wily old hand. And what I would say is you need to build into your descriptors words like indicative and normally, to allow yourself that bit of wiggle room. And it's a shame if you've had to postpone things because they've missed the boat, but actually the chances are that you'll be able to talk to your QA people now and say, depending on how rigorous your university is and how, frankly, how silly your university is, and you'll be able to do something about it this year if you get straight on to the people who are making decisions. And if that doesn't work in the QA office, go up and up till you get to the Vice Chancellor, and go and see the Vice Chancellor or his proxy or her proxy and say, come on, we can't do this. It's silly. Help us to make it work for the students.
Okay, thanks, Si. Bo, have you got any thoughts from your experience?
Yeah, no, we ran into the same issues, of course. Some of us we're in the middle of teaching, and of course the syllabus or the course outline, whatever you want to call it, was already set in stone, and the exam is, you know, months away. And basically what our university decided, then we created a new overarching exam committee. Exam committee in the Netherlands is a body that makes sure that students actually deserve their diploma. And they made an assessment committee, exam committee, to figure out how to do all the online testing. And what they came down on was saying, okay, take a look at your syllabus, take a look at your course outline, and take a look at the learning outcomes of your particular course. Those you need to address, but you don't have to address them in exactly the same way as you intended to do. So you might even already have shared some like practice exams with students, because we also, that's a big practice in the Netherlands. We always give our students practice exams to work on. But you don't have to adhere to the practice exams, but you do need to address the learning outcomes of the course. And if you want to do that in a different way, they developed a bit of a form that you could say, well, this was my intended way of doing it, but now given the circumstances, I now intend to do it like this. And then they would look at it and actually give you some feedback on, well, have you thought about this method? Have you thought about this method? And so we basically had a committee of Sally Browns helping us out, trying to determine the best way of addressing the learning outcomes. So that's how we dealt with it at our university. So luckily not so rigid as saying, okay, well, you just have to do it like you did before, but now online, because that doesn't always work.
So you're running open book online exams, were you?
Oh yeah, we're doing open book, closed book, on exams, papers. You know, we do everything, basically everything you can think of. One of the things that I'm reading a lot in the Q&A is, well, how do you make sure that you avoid cheating and communication between students? And that was a major problem for me as well, because even before we had our online teaching in a nice setup with, you know, some kind of proctoring or something going on, I had my students do exams in Canvas, which is a learning management system, but it's not really a testing system. And my exams were 3 hours, and I would create nice exams. But what turned out is that there's all these online sources where you can ask for help. And they promise you a 2-hour turnaround on your questions. So you can imagine if it's a 3-hour exam, students would basically just copy paste the exam questions into that system. And 2 hours later, they got responses. Luckily for me, not everyone who works for those platforms is as smart as I am. So sometimes they made mistakes. And then I would easily identify that, because if 10 students give the same incorrect answer, you know, okay, they got this from some software. So I started logging into these tools, and I found, of course, that my questions were actually copy pasted in those systems. So one thing that I now do, particularly for numerical courses, because I teach things like statistics, is I create randomized exams with formula questions such that students can't really cheat because they all have different numbers. Does that help, Paul?
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, in the chat, there's some very interesting comments from Theo about the gains he's seen from the use of open book exams, which is quite interesting. Carol, do you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I mean, gosh, it's massive, isn't it? There are some things that if you go for open book, then as we all know, you need to be asking completely different questions. It's fundamental. We used, again, there are different levels of proctoring. We used from the ones which actually disable all the other software on a student's computer, so they can't get around that, but they could have other people in the room. They could have somebody behind the camera showing them stuff. So you get into all those stupid mind games with that. A lot of people went for limiting the number of hours that the exam was open to. For proctors, some of you put you could only do 400 students. Yes, we had thousands of students, so we'd split students into smaller groups to be able to use the proctoring. And basically, we only used it where it was needed for a regulatory body. because it's blimmin' expensive, but also, as I said, you're diverting the attention away from what we should be doing in terms of quality assessment to checking whether they're cheating or not, which is to me massively problematic. I think there are I do think we need to drastically change the way we assess as the context moves on. But as I said, the biggest gains we got were working on real life examples, tackling real solutions. But also the big thing that came up linked to that is that we had a very agile policy board that I've always believed that policy should not be a static thing, as is curriculum, and it evolves. And obviously, I always want people to test policy to see if it does work, or where it shouldn't be straitjacking any discipline, and sometimes it does. And how do we have agile processes in a university to allow people to make, I read in the chat, somebody said we have to wait a year. Well, that's not good enough in the current context. It's actually letting our students down. Also, if we're talking about relevance, I was talking to some students today who were being examined on stuff that was in the workplace 10 years ago. Well, what's the point? Yeah, it proves that they can learn, but it doesn't prove that it's not going to be useful to them moving forward. So I think we do have a duty to look at where are those opportunities to involve them in novel and interesting ways. And actually, can we assess, the smartest way of assessment is, can we actually assess more with less? What's the ideal form of assessment that really, it's a bit like that killer question that we all design for interviews. What's the killer question which you know whether that person is employable? It's the same with what's the killer thing that you, well, good language, but what's the one thing that they need to be able to do? And what's the best form to test them on it? And that, I think we need to be thinking far more along those lines rather than the volume.
Yes, and I'm just commenting. I mean, Sally said right at the start about we need to move away from this privileged position exams have. It shouldn't be the default. It's just a form of assessment which needs to be justified, as any other form of assessment needs to be justified. So I've got something with Dion commenting in the chat here about moving on from talking about exams, which I think we should do. I mean, earlier on, there was very comments in the chat about UniWise, the new platform, in the assessment platform. We just thought from my experience in here, we've actually run pilots this year with UniWise and with Inspiro, which is the other main sort of European-based e-assessment platform, which was very, very interesting. And we didn't use them at all for exams, I have to say. We did use them for a whole range of other types of assessments. And it's been really very useful. And one of the biggest impacts we've found and we're working through now is that both those platforms are role-based platforms. So you define particular roles within processes. And it's led us to do a real rethink about all our QA processes around assessments, which were very dated, very cumbersome, had that old-fashioned exam coursework split. So it's triggered a big debate around not just assessments itself, but how we process and the workflows around assessment, which in some ways, as Carol just hinted at, can be a real block on moving assessment forward in innovation. So I think if you're interested in those particular assessment platforms, it is really worth having a look at them, maybe get some demos in. Because we were finding out those people who were involved in the pilots were having to fundamentally rethink what they're assessing and why they're assessing. And one of the things we tried to get to happen through those pilots is for course teams to develop rubrics, which was really interesting because they'd never really thought through why they're assessing a certain thing in a particular way. And the fashion team in particular, it was fascinating seeing how they approach this. So I don't know whether any of the panelists want to come in on this about broadening out assessments beyond just exams. Experiences from the last 12 months, 18 months. Sally, anything else you want to add?
Sorry, I was just reading the comments in the box. Ask the question, just prompt me again.
your experience of the assessments away, online assessments away from just purely examinations?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a very long history, and here I would refer particularly to the work of the UK Open University. I know the Dutch Open University has a lot of great experience as well, but I'd particularly refer to the UK Open University because that's what I'm familiar with. And I know that they have a whole range of questions which involve lots of different formats. The ones I really like, and not just the ones where you answer one question from 5, but where you have to, the next set of questions, answer one question from 5 as to why that is the correct response. I like question types that involve a graph where you click on the graph at the profit point or the important stage. I like graphs, pictures where you drag and drop, where you add labels. I like things that are more challenging, and I also like things that give students lots of opportunity for choice, for self-development, and for things that are going to be engaging to them personally and not just available for everybody to do exactly the same thing.
Can I pick up on that one as well? I mean, I think, again, the more we can test process rather than purely product, the better. So, for example, really good assignments we looked at were group-based projects where it was, to what extent could that group identify the skill sets of individual members to be able to put together the output for a company. But we also wanted to, a bit like the film Argo, when they get stuck at the airport, and they have to show how their cartoons made the film. If ever you've seen that film, and they had to show how they got there. So good assessments would be with students showing how they got there. The end product, yeah, fine, but how did you get there is really fascinating. The other one about choice, I think go and look at some of the TED videos on that, because choice is also an anathema for us all. And one thing that we have proven through assessment time and time again is that if students are bad at managing their own learning, they're poor self-regulators, guess what? They make really bad choices. So it's not that they shouldn't have choice. The issue is that they need negotiated choice. They needed to be supported to make sure they're making informed choices. And that links actually to integrity. And too often I still see the fact that if you go and check where students have choices, do that analysis, do they do equally as well? And too many times when I'm evaluating things, I find that if they'd have made this particular choice, they would have done better, which is bad assessment, because that's exclusive assessment, not inclusive. So it's not the word itself, it's the interpretation of it that I think needs much more care, because I actually do think we're inadvertently disadvantaging loads of students by the way that we're trying to actually be inclusive, but it actually works out the wrong way.
Is there, sorry, Carl, can I just add, is there any sort of work going on around the impacts on inclusivity through this shift to online assessment?
There's been loads of work. There's been loads of work done in Australia and also in the States in the first wave, the very first wave, to look at, and that looked more at disadvantage from not being able to access online systems, or the fact that a lot of the requirements required downloads that were too big. Massive mental health issues for students who actually, I can't get this resource. There's just nowhere for me to work, all of those kind of issues. So they looked at it from a digital poverty point of view in terms of that. How much work there's gone on at the moment in terms of looking at specifically that differential impact, I'm not sure of at present, but it was something that I was monitoring through using data analytics to pick up. Because generally speaking, most of us, I think we could all say that we put in place safeguards so that students wouldn't be disadvantaged, didn't we? So in actual fact, most of us will have seen a grade uplift. Now, some people say that grade uplift across the board was because actually students had access to better resources. So there was also that. Some of it was because we were not counting fail grades in certain things, or we were allowing them to pass through. So, but it is fascinating when you actually look at those changes to actually ask, it's a critical pedagogy view, isn't it? That whatever you do has a knock-on effect, and we need to make sure that who's been knocked on badly from this. And I think that's something that universities do need to be looking at, but they tend to look at it at more of a general level. Do the grade distribution look okay? But in actual fact, when you look at particular groups or different groups of intersectionality of different things, you may find very, very different patterns. What it did do is exacerbated the children and the students with low political and social economic capital, because they didn't have the quality of networks. That's why providing students with networks and links to good resources is like unlocking the door to a library that they have no access to. And I feel very passionately about that, because they don't necessarily find the right networks. We did a mapping exercise at one university I worked in, and you could predict how students would do by asking them to draw who they went to get advice from. And it was that clear that you could predict from the quality of the networks. I mean, it's not rocket science, but and obviously that gap between more and less well off in the UK is exaggerated due to COVID in terms of students having to catch up, and that will be exacerbated in universities as well. So.
Okay, thanks, guys. Bo, have you any thoughts on this? I mean, has your university done any work around inclusivity and the impact of the online assessments you've been using?
Inclusivity in what sense, Paul? Sorry.
Well, the digital poverty which you mentioned.
Yeah.
Address that. Has there been any impact of that on student results?
No. So as I mentioned, in the Netherlands, we really didn't have much of an issue with that. There were only a few students who we had to help out. We have about 20 laptop PCs in our library that we can loan out, and so we loaned out a couple of those, and that was really it. But I talked to some colleagues in Africa and Asia, and they were struggling with this a lot more, because I would tell them, oh, you can do online exams. And they said, yeah, no, we cannot. So that would be, that's a different issue altogether. And I'm sorry, I was trying to figure out some answers to people on the chat.
Yeah,
There's so many questions on the chat and the Q&A.
Just trying to catch up, so yeah.
But I did give everyone a quick task, and you can do that after this session if you like. The website that my students were using is called check.com. So it's like check, but then with 2 G's, because I guess these guys can't even spell. But anyway, you can check that out if you'd like. And if you just copy paste some of your exam questions in there, you'll probably find them. You need to pay a little bit of money to get full access. So I did that actually for 1 month, so I could actually track everything. But that opened my eyes a lot to what students nowadays do. So anyway, that's what I've been working on. Sorry, Paul.
That's all right. Yeah, thanks, Bo.
The other one I found, Paul, was that the timing of things might need to change, because they kind of they work out differently in an online space, and therefore the timings may not make sense. And quite a lot of students were picking that up as well, in terms of this now no longer works because of this mode of delivery. It's not going to work in that kind of way. So it's also, to what extent are universities flexible in being able to, and their policies enabling them to tweak those dates, but then obviously the knock-on effect on everything else needs to also be considered. But yeah, that's all I would say there.
Okay. Sally, you've been unusually quiet for a while. Do you want to?
Well, I do let other people speak sometimes. I wanted to pick up on Dave Horn's point. I don't know where you are in the world, Dave, but formative assessment, any advice on how to enable and encourage teachers to provide effective feedback, and how to persuade students to read and listen to it and respond to it? Deal with the first one first. I bet Carol Evans has found the same. I found for years and years and years of passionate advocacy, nothing worked as well as when I became a Pro Vice Chancellor, and I was able to build it into university policy and get the might of the university behind it. So you actually need a commitment from the university. And the way I got the might of the university behind it, and the way I got that take up across the university, was by drinking a lot of tea and eating a lot of scones, going round people to lobby them before anything went through the faculty committees, the university strategy committee, and then the full board. That was the lobbying. So I think the one way, Dave, to make sure formative assessment happens is to build it into university strategy and policy, and have the senior managers really mean it. Now, how do you persuade students to read and listen to respond to it? Here I'd refer to the amazing work of Helen Webster at Newcastle University Writing Development Centre, because she at the Writing Development Centre produces a whole load of student resources that are about effectively meta learning. But the key thing I'm mentioning here is building students' assessment literacy. If we start from day one of week one of semester one, talking to students about what they get back from their tutors, not being like the snarky, unpleasant comments that many of them would have got prior they got to university, but it's actually there to help them. That formative assessment is supposed to form and shape and transform them, that formative assessment matters. So you might then build in tasks like the esteemed Phil Race used to do, which is to say, here are your comments, you won't get your mark until you've responded to them. And again, the Open University did that. Or to actually give up some of the time that you spend in a classroom, which was on tuition, which nowadays we've got so many brilliant ways of delivering information rather than just in us telling them stuff. Spend some of that time doing generic feedback to the students so that they can actually see that what you're doing is to try and help them actually learn from the feedback, that it's going to transform. And here I think Carol's put something in the chat box, the framework for institutional change. I think the key thing we've got to do is work from both ends, persuade the senior managers of the university to back up people across the university in making sure it's given, and to then persuade students that it's worth reading. One anecdote before I shut up and pass on to other people. I was asked to go to a very, very, very eminent university in Scotland, which had absolutely the bottom marks in our UK National Student Survey for assessment. Absolutely rubbish. They were the worst in the nation. I went in and I spent a couple of big sessions there with lots of people, and I found out that the Deputy Vice Chancellor had been going round saying to staff, don't give any formative assessment, only use unseen exams and MCQs, because then you can have the extra time for your research. That policy directive from the Deputy Vice Chancellor stuffed them up for years, frankly. So what I would say is lead from the top. To make change, you've got to have passion, conviction, scholarly backup, and high-level champions.
Yeah, I kind of, I'll go even further than that. Obviously, I've done bottom up and top down, but it's, for me, every university has multiple cultures, and assessment is one of the most politically, we're all involved in it and we're all affected by it. I think you have to work to get a shared understanding, and the assessment and feedback principles that are part of the framework were developed. They took my research to students and felt that this was gobbledygook in terms of language. They rewrote it. And basically we embedded it across every discipline in a university. And I've done that in Australia and in the UK. And the thing for me is that if we really want to change things, a policy needs to be something that's owned by everybody, not an individual, not something you go to when something goes wrong. And it needs to be accessible. So the first thing I always want to do is rewrite the policies and practices, but with students, and actually preferably have students taking quite a significant lead on them, but I'm quite a long way along that line. But it has to be something where we have shared understandings. And unfortunately, going back to Sally's point, often people will say, this is the way we do it here. And you'll often find that's not even policy. And understanding of principal policies and procedures in universities is pretty variable. And it's how we engage students in doing that for themselves. And that's why, like many of my colleagues, I'm an advocate for students writing the exams. I'm an advocate for students marking. If you go to the work of Schneider and Preckle, good meta-analysis, if you're into meta-analysis, it's not the only form. But if you go there, the most impactful things, apart from students' prior attainment, is students' ability to be able to mark their work accurately. And my premise is the whole aim of assessment is that somebody needs to be able to judge the quality of their work without needing to rely on anybody else. If you've done that, game done, you've sorted it. So for me, it's how do you actually empower students genuinely to do that? And as Sally says, you need top down, but you need bottom up, but it has to be across the whole fabric of an organization, and you need to have a shared language. That takes time, lots of teas, lots of coffees, lots of cake, let's go French. But it does take a lot of that.
Okay, thanks, Carol. And Sally, from your experiences of working right at the top of university, it's very interesting what you're saying. I think the other issue for me is staff assessment literacy, not just student assessment literacy. And it's changing that culture and mindset, which I think the pandemic has actually forced some rethinking along those lines. There's an awful lot coming in the chat, which I'm struggling to keep up with.
Can I piggyback on what you just said, Paul? Because
yes,
I think there's another assessment literacy we need, and that is, let's call it vice chancellors. Because I've worked, with consultancy, strategic level, where a vice chancellor's gone in one day and said, right, everybody in this university is only going to use multi-choice assessment because we haven't got time to do proper assessment. That's not the Scottish university, that's another university. Within 2 days, he had to back off because the fashion and the nurses and everybody else. I've worked with other places where they say, right, there is only going to be one assessment per module, and you're not allowed to split it up into little bits, and it's got to be at the end. So we've got to educate the people at the top who go around making daft policy decisions. And the way we are able to do that this year more than anywhere else is everybody in this area, me, Carol, Bo, you, Paul, have for the first time, I think, had a much more open door than we ever had before, because just as your senior managers have had to turn to specialists on technological things, they've had to turn to assessment experts to say, what the heck are we going to do? And we are pushing against an open door to actually educate the top people in the university so we can bring about the changes we can need.
Thank you, Sally. Yes, and I agree. I mean, actually, it's interesting because my particular role, institutional leave assessment, I was put in post just before the pandemic, and we actually have a very enlightened senior management team in university who were and that we've had a big move away from exams, all sorts. And my role was specifically there to drive this through across the whole institution. And coming from a business school background, what I very quickly realised was that diversity of assessment like you mentioned before. The way the nursing courses assess, and the fashion, and there is just a diversity. You cannot have one size fits all solution at all.
Often you find, that's a good point, Paul. Often you find that it's quite interesting. I'll give you an exercise. I can go in and download any assessment policy, and you can usually work out the background of the person who wrote it, because it will have a disciplinary bent. No disrespect, but it will. And the issue for me is, and that's why I really always tried to develop very strong interdisciplinary groups, because I think it's good to challenge, and it's good to say, just because I do this in one place, why can't it work in that place? I think the killer question for all academics is a very simple question. What's the rationale behind what you're doing? And that's absolutely fascinating, but why? Why do you need to actually do that? What would you gain from not doing that? And also, I think it's that, to me, it's if we actually really thought this through and invested as much as we do in other areas of university activity, we would save vast amounts of time, because there are lots of activities that actually don't, the way I approach it through the framework is it has to be high quality and it has to be research informed, but it also has to have bang for buck. To be crude, if it's not going to make much of a difference, then really, should we be asking colleagues to invest in that? And the problem with the change around in structures a lot in universities, and some are increasing module size, some are reducing module size. There seems to be a cycle of undoing things and redoing them. And sometimes we throw out things which may not work, but they could work with a tweak. And I think it really needs much more thought and much more care in order to save time. But I do think if people looked at the impact of a lot of things, we really should be questioning why we're doing them.
Yeah, okay. We are getting into the last 5 minutes, can we just finish by looking ahead a little bit? I've heard the phrase quite a few times that the toothpaste won't go back in the tube. Do we all feel that? I mean, Bo, do you think we'll move on or go back?
I actually was just answering a question in the Q&A about that, because partly at least of my pushing for online testing, we had just set up a system at my university before COVID struck, where we have 400 Chromebooks, and they will be set up in the testing hall, and students can take their exams there, but they're taking them online, but on our materials. So they cannot, well, it's really hard to cheat that way, because they also go into a testing software which closes off the internet, and it's a dedicated internet connection. So it's really hard to get around that. We actually invited some students to try to hack it, and they could not, and they were one of the best, hacking students that we had available. So anyway, we had that whole system set up with, like I said, 400 Chromebooks, everything set up. And then of course, everyone was sent home. But we have that system. And the main issue we had with that system was that the instructors didn't want to create exams in the online system in Cirrus. But now they have been doing that for the last 1.5 years as well. So now we basically have the hardware in place. We have the software, which I call the professors the software. We have the software in place as well. So when we go back to physical classes, physical testing, we will still use some of the lessons learned and have online exams, but just on campus. So that's where we are headed, and I think that's a good mix. One of the things also that Carol was pointing out, because of all of this, we were forced to look at our syllabi. We were forced to look at our course outlines. Like, why are you testing the way you're testing? Why are you doing it this way? And for myself, I've changed my course because of this, and I think for the better. I would like to think so anyway, but I think most of us have been doing that. So I think actually in the end, the old saying, never waste a good crisis, is definitely true here as well. And I think we'll all come out better.
Okay, thank you. Carol, your thoughts on this?
My thoughts, I've spoken to quite a lot of universities who I work with, and some are retrenching already, interestingly, some, which surprised me, and they were very honest about that. They're saying, actually, we will retrench, we'll go back to as it was. I think that's a massive shame. We haven't mentioned program level assessment here today, which is quite interesting. But the more, what it brought to bear is, again, using resources well, that notion of team-based design and thinking about how the course maps out across the whole program and sharing resources, I think is actually vital. For me, the biggest thing moving forward is that understanding of I found a lot of misunderstandings of inclusivity in terms of people thinking it's not treating everybody the same. But I found lots of misinterpretations of how that was being implemented. I would love there to be more emphasis on critically evaluating the impact of what we do, because I'm really, I get up better every day because it's about how do we make things better for everybody. It's the universal design notion. You design an environment that everybody can get into. They might use it in completely different ways, but you don't design it with one person in mind. And I'm really bothered at the moment about that. But I do think, I'm hoping that universities will give people more time to come together as a team to evaluate their practice, because it will save them masses of time. In one university I've worked, we actually put in the workload model time for groups to come together, because we felt it was so absolutely essential. And that's the one thing that I would be looking for. And also, markers who have nothing to do with the course is massively problematic. So again, that need to bring teams together, because you're not on the same page necessarily, and that's not fair to our students or us, actually. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, Carol. Sally?
Well, I'm going to do a yes and a no. We can't force the first page back in the tube, but I think the dementors, to use a Harry Potter phrase, the dementors of regression are standing in the wings saying, right, you've all had your fun, let's go back to doing it the proper way. At which point, all 136 people who are on this webinar and all our friends to rise up as one and wave our magic wands and say, yes, but here is the research-based evidence that shows that what we've done this year has been giving a pandemic bonus, not in any way to diminish the appalling, and I've experienced it within my own family, the appalling aspects of the pandemic. But there have been bonuses. A lot of things in learning and teaching, and particularly assessment, have got better for disadvantaged students, notwithstanding all the stuff we've been talking about with Kit. Students who have been able to access virtually what they struggled to access live. So there is a post-pandemic bonus. There are marvellous things. And what we've got to make sure that we fight the good fight off the dementors of regression. And as I say, the magic wand is to show from the research, surely to goodness we've all been tracking it, the research we've been doing in the last year, get it out there as fast as we can. And people who are editors of journals have to help on this. Let's have things very fast indeed that show that what we've been doing this year is so much more positive and magical than what went on in the past.
Thank you, Sally. That's bang on 2 o'clock. So I think that's a very appropriate call to arms end to the whole webinar. And thank you all very much for the participants. I'm not sure who won the prize for being the furthest away. And maybe Brandy's been looking, I don't know. But thank you all very much. And hopefully you can join us for the 4th and final one in this series, which is in about a month's time. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Paul, for being our chair today. And thank you so much, Carol, Sally, and both for being our panel, and for everybody who's contributed and joined. It's been a really engaging and fascinating conversation. I do hope you've all found it helpful. As I mentioned at the beginning, we will be sharing the recording of the session. So please do feel free to watch it back, to share it with colleagues, and to to engage with us as to whether you found this helpful or would like us to have more sessions like this. If there's any themes or topics that you think it would be helpful to as we move into the autumn, we're very happy to host these events and look at the things that might be helpful to you and your colleagues in your teaching lives. So do get in touch. Thank you once again. So you will receive an email in the next couple of days with the recording. And I thank you all again for joining us and for your expertise.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye-bye.